Welcome to Everyday Ethics from the BBC with me, Audrey Carville. Ethical tourism. Is your holiday destroying the world's greatest treasures? And have you been on your holidays this year? Did you go abroad or did you stay here at home? What influences you when you're making your choices about where to go? Well, in many holiday hotspots across Europe at the moment, the locals are getting tired of the tourists. They're protesting at the impact they are having on pushing up rental prices, but also about the damage they're doing to archaeological sites, as well as to the streets, to the monuments and to the buildings that they call home. So will we be forced into making ethical choices when it comes to holidaying in the future? Is the best ethical choice simply to stay at home? Well, joining us this morning, the editor of Travel Extra, Eoghan Corry, Suzanne Power, Operations Manager with Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, Lynn Hughes of Wanderlust Travel Magazine, and the Reverend Chris Hudson. You're all very welcome indeed. Eoghan, would you just briefly tell us what's happening in Barcelona? What has caused the locals there and in Venice, Dubrovnik as well, what has caused them to protest?
You've hit on the three key places. The first emergence of anti-tourism, strong anti-tourism sentiment came in Venice. It became apparent over a long period of time that Venice was becoming a very difficult place to live. It was expensive. The population within the city began to decline and has come down substantially in the last 4 or 5 years. And we saw similar sentiments arise, emerging in Dubrovnik. Barcelona was a special case in point, because the new mayor elected 2 years ago started implementing measures which were designed to curtail this crushing, choking influx of tourists into the city, which was making life difficult for the locals. And the ethical debate has always been there in the background, but I think there was an assumption that tourism is good, it's the rising tide that lifts all boats, and it brings money into parts of the world where there aren't many other alternatives. I think that consensus has been shaken by the series of protests, and they've spread to other towns in Spain in recent weeks. And
Susanna, I read too that sites in Athens, archaeological sites, are being damaged to an extent that it's going to cost an absolute fortune to repair them. Closer to home, there are fears about Skellig Michael in County Kerry. Do the protesters have a point?
Oh yes, absolutely, protesters have a point, but also we mustn't forget the very good positive effects that tourism has globally, not just economically in terms of 10% of global jobs, 10% of global GDP, also a lot of tourism exports coming into the country, but also environmental benefits and socio-cultural benefits of tourism. But the question really is how we manage that growth in tourism. We can't continue with a very sort of high volume, low yield tourism strategy that we see in a lot of those places. We have to diversify out. We have to find alternative means of managing tourism growth. And we really have to ask the question of whose responsibility is it to do that? And personally, I think that the industry itself needs to take leadership, show leadership here in developing more sustainable, more ethical tourism.
Industry-led rather than personal responsibility, would you say?
Yes, I would think so, because in essence, we talked about this with Reverend Chris Hudson briefly there. Tourism in itself is a hedonistic exercise. We go on holiday because we want to improve our own personal well-being. We want to switch off, we want to relax, we want to see something new, we want to go on an adventure.
So it's a very selfish thing to do.
It is, in essence, a selfish exercise. But at the same time, I think in this case, we cannot rely on the traveller to be the leader in terms of responsibility or responsible tourism. I mean, that's not saying that every traveller is completely selfish when they go on holiday, but as a group, I don't think that the travellers or the tourists are the ones that we can rely on. Industry has the responsibility to show leadership. They need to sustain their own tourism product by developing it sustainably. But also they have a moral responsibility because society legitimizes what industry does. So therefore they have to show that they're developing tourism in a sustainable way.
And Lynn Hughes of Wanderlust. Lynn, you're very welcome to Sunday Sequence. How would industry do that?
Well, this is where I question whether it really is down to the industry, because I think the industry, yes, has got a role to play. It has got to bring in more sustainable products, and it has got to be able to communicate those to the clients. But at the end of the day, the industry they're going to put their hands up, aren't they, and say, oh, but people want to go to Barcelona, they want to go on huge cruise ships, they want to go to Venice. And so I really think that what we are going to see is more and more actual government initiatives, local authorities, local governments. I think we're going to see more, perhaps eco taxes like the Balearics have. Now, they introduced the taxes again, I think it was last year. They tried a few years ago to introduce an eco tax, and at the time it met with a lot of opposition, and the travel industry was very against it. But this time it has been introduced, and successfully. And I really wonder if that's going to happen in many more of these places, that they will make sure that, whether somebody is renting out accommodation in these places, or whether it's a case of the large cruise ships coming in, I think there'll be a lot of taxes applied.
Reverend Chris Hudson. Chris, good to see you again. Do you make ethical choices when you travel? Do you think about the impact on God's creation?
I think, Audrey, I'd be totally dishonest if I tried to give what would seem like a prescribed clergyman's answer to that. I probably would agree we should make ethical choices. However, the reality is that we look at the cost, and of course with low airfares, naturally that is one of the big incentives to go to places, and because low airfares take us to destinations we never dreamed of going, and particular beautiful cities like Barcelona and Venice and so on.
And then Airbnb make it possible to stay.
I was going to say
places.
that the damaging impact of Airbnb is also it's because it's now become a more attractive proposition for making money, that people who live in those cities, live in those areas that are extremely popular, are now being denied a place to live. And that, I think, something does need to be done about that by the local authorities. But getting back to your initial question, I am now taking choices to try and go to places, less popular places, and mainly because I enjoy them more myself. If I want to look at a piece of art or a painting, I don't want to be with a group of 100 people and 90 of them photographing the painting while I'm trying to see it. And recently I actually took a trip to the Isle of Man. Now, this is not necessarily a plug for the Isle of Man, but I have been around the world a couple of times and I'd never been to the Isle of Man. And I found it a fascinating place, but also from a religious point of view, a place of I think, pilgrimage, because there are beautiful walks, hugely historical, and it has a huge influence on the Christian dimension of these islands, because as you know, one of the most popular places is the Camino de Santiago, which is the famous walk across the north of Spain through the Basque Land and Galicia and into Santiago de Compostela, the famous cathedral there of St. James. And that in itself, I would have criticism of that now, because to be fair, the locals are beginning to say, well, these people are not pilgrims. They're eating in the best restaurants. They're drinking the wine. That is actually pushing up the prices. Mm-hmm. And that is having an impact on the local community. And I've often heard people saying to me, I'm going to go on the Camino, it's very spiritual. And I often wonder, what do they mean by that? Why not maybe take a track up Croagh Patrick? That'll be a lot more spiritual, and you'll use burn up so energy, and there's not too many restaurants on the way up. So yes, the
local priest there too says the mountain is eroding.
Well, I did hear that. Yes, I did hear that.
Exactly. Oh, and let me come back to you. If we're talking about being ethical tourists, and if the least ethical thing is to fly all around the world and see as many cities and places as we can, or the most ethical thing to do is to stay at home and go nowhere, where on that line should we be?
Well, I didn't want to jump in there on Suzanne's point about the industry, but I can tell you that it's not going to happen that the industry will regulate this. The industry reacts to consumer demand. Consumer demand is led by things like marketing, fashion. Sometimes the places they go aren't the most beautiful, but they just tend to be the most accessible. It's interesting. It's spotty how people approach around the world, how people will approach ethical tourism. The Scandinavians have led on this, but Europe's biggest outbound market, Germany, hasn't really, and you would expect Germans to have bought into it a little bit more, hasn't bought into it in sufficient numbers for the industry to start reacting to it. I think what will happen is consumers will say, this is what we want to do, we want to change our habits, and the industry will react. And until then, we're left with no other choice but for governments to step in and regulate. There's different things mixed in here. There's actually, what we're seeing the protests about is how huge influxes of tourism affect the lives of locals, and that's what is at the stem of the protests. The environmental damage, and there's no doubt, to having tourists stampeding through a fragile environment like Greece, like people going on safari in Africa. It is causing huge damage, but it's a very difficult ethical choice to say to poor countries in Africa, you're not entitled to take the baubles of international tourism because some international regulatory body has decided it's not in your interests. The compromise we've seen is pricing and management. Coming close to home, Newgrange, very fragile site. They got 1,700 visitors trundling through in one day in 1985. They decided enough was enough. They had to build a replica centre the other side of the Boyne. It's working very fine. Some people come along and say, I want to see the original, and small numbers can still see the original. Lascaux in France, the Stone Age cave paintings, people still are not allowed to see the original at all. So the international industry can react, but it tends not to react because the travel industry decides that it's some regulatory authority that stands up and says enough is enough. And the other point you raise, low-cost aviation, the global warming implications, the carbon footprint of international tourism, it's a multiple. I mean, Dublin Airport's numbers are doing what Heathrow did in the early 80s. Is it the correct decision to start telling people that our airfares should go back to the huge prices that they were in the past, and a whole class of people who got to travel by air should be denied that, especially when other ends of it are not being addressed ethically? The carbon burn of low-cost airlines is a fraction of what's been burned by military test aircraft all over Western Europe. I do think there has been an uneven approach to this, and we have been leaning a little bit on travellers, saying it's your decision not to do this destructive thing, when in fact we should be taking a more compromised approach. And what the approaches I see looking around the world are admission prices for the most crowded inner city parts of the inner city, the walled cities of Italy and Spain. Some of them have started introducing €10 charges.
Okay.
It's reduced the numbers, and everybody seems happy at the end of it. And I would hold up the example from the safari side of Botswana. They're ridiculously expensive. The Okavango Delta is one of the most beautiful, most fragile environments in the world. They make a lot of tourism money out of it by charging each tourist a huge amount. Everybody wants to be Botswana. No, very sadly, a lot of them have to chase bigger numbers because they don't get the revenues out of it. But definitely pricing, paying more for to go to the places that are fragile, are the places where the locals are most cranky about having too many visitors.
Absolutely.
That seems to be the way forward that internationally we're going.
Oh, and you raised so many points there. A reminder, we're discussing ethical tourism this morning. What influences your choices as to when you're making your decision where to go on your holidays? Eoghan Corry, he's editor of Travel Extra. Suzanne Power of Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful is here. We're joined too by Lynn Hughes of Wanderlust Travel Magazine and by the Reverend Chris Hudson. Lynn, will you pick up there on that last point that Eoghan raised about the locals benefiting from the financial impact of the tourism? If there was more of that, if locals did share in the profits of the tourists, would that make a difference?
That would make a huge difference. And I think, what's happening at the moment, if you take somewhere like Barcelona, it's attracting large cruise ships, so it gets these massive influx of people coming in. Now, if somebody's been on a cruise ship, they'll have had their breakfast on board, they've got all the amenities on board, they have huge buffets and everything. So, of course, when they come to Venice, to Barcelona, or whatever, they're not looking to spend money. They may have lunch there, but that's about it. And so very little money is actually filtering out to the people. And again, in Barcelona, it's one of the key places in the world where Airbnb's made a real impact. Excuse me. And and in that case, although the people staying in the Airbnb rentals, okay, you can argue their money is being spent in restaurants, in shops. It does, on the other hand, it's affecting property prices and rental prices, and the locals are finding they can't afford to rent in the centre of Barcelona anymore. So what Catalonia is doing is it's trying to push people out from Barcelona, and it's saying, yes, we want you to come to Catalonia, not just to Barcelona, but to Catalonia. Maybe have a night in Barcelona, but then please go out to the rest of our beautiful region where we have national parks, where you can go riding, you can go trekking, you can go hiking.
Girona,
beautiful,
Tarragona.
beautiful villages. Yeah, and I think this is it. There are, Owen commented on the case that there's the places that are the most popular are not necessarily the most beautiful. Yes, they are special, but there are so many other places in the world that would love to have just a little bit of tourism. So if we can spread people out into these rural communities where people would actually benefit, then that way the money is spread around, and that's where tourism is a force for good.
Chris, what about that other point that Eoghan raised about how it's difficult to tell people in African countries who rely on tourism to such a large extent because of their own financial situation that perhaps tourists won't be coming there because of what we're talking about, because of the ethical concerns?
Well, in a previous life, Audrey, I was a trade union official, and I had reason to visit Brazil to meet with trade unionists who worked in pretty bleak conditions. And what struck me there was how a very expensive level of tourism sat upon the poorest of the poor. And it was quite clear to me that the poorest of the poor did not enjoy any benefits from
Never
that
saw them.
tourism. No, and most of the tourism there as well was international tourist organisations and hotel chains. And when I visited India for Oxfam, I saw exactly the same thing in India. So I do think there is a serious ethical issue there. But the problem is, Audrey, who can actually change that? Personally, I think Eoghan made some very good points. It can only be changed locally, and it has to be a political decision locally as well. So that means people being very conscious of who is gaining from tourism in their area and who is suffering. And one of the things, Audrey, we probably should bear in mind, I'm no expert on this, but I'm sure we're in the very early stages of the development of tourism. As other economies grow and become powerful economies, we're going to see people from a lot of the emerging strong economies travelling around the world. What sort of policies will they have? Will they even care about what happens when they visit someone, as long as they have their 200 photographs when they get back?
Suzanne, will you jump in there and tell us how you see that being addressed?
The question that was raised as well, how can we manage this growth? And I've seen a lot of examples where the industry has actually taken leadership and has decided they need to step up. One of the nice examples is the geopark of Cliffs of Moher and the Burren in Ireland. So the local tourism industry has created the Burren Ecotourism Network, because they were in a situation where honeypot tourism to the Cliffs of Moher was just putting too much pressure on that particular area there. So it was just bus tours coming in from Dublin, just as Lynn was describing there. They would just come, look at the cliffs and drive away. So that's a great example how the industry has
And what did they do?
Well, they formed a group and said, what we need to do is we have to work together, all accommodation providers, local transport providers, local attractions, to build up a new tourism product that will be attractive to visitors, so that they will not just go on a day trip and look at the cliffs and then go away again, but they will actually stay overnight. They will stay in the vicinity, in the location, spend money, and it is that sort of low volume, high yield tourism which we need to see. And actually, what Eoghan was talking about with Botswana is very interesting, because the Botswana Tourism Authority has, for over the last few years, been very, very strong in driving that low volume, high yield strategy. And unfortunately, I don't think we're seeing this here in Northern Ireland at the moment. What we're seeing here in Northern Ireland is just quite the opposite. It is more towards honey trap tourism. It is more towards bus tourism and cruise ships. And we should look at good best practice examples in the industry and learn from those.
Yeah, Lynn, is it possible to be an ethical tourist and make ethical choices by and large, when all of the issues that we've discussed here, all the points that have been raised, is the most ethical way to live ethically is to stay at home, essentially?
No, I really believe that you can actually be a force for good by going somewhere. And one of the best trips I had this year was I went to southern Rajasthan, to a very rural area, very beautiful. And the people there were living in terrible poverty. It's they've got some of the worst poverty even within India. But actually, some very low-key, low-impact tourism there is making a big difference. And it means that people are improving the wells that they have to produce more water. It means that children are getting educated, including girls, and girls are staying in school. And, classrooms are being built. It means that the number of food crops are different, the variety of food crops are growing. And this isn't just because of the tourism, it's going hand in hand with a particular foundation and charity that was in this area at the moment as well. But it's really good to see this effect that it's having, where, education is improving, people's day-to-day life, people's health are improving, jobs are being generated to work in this limited number of lodges and camps that are around. People are training to be guides, and so on. And it was a really, really good example of how good tourism can be, and how it can raise living standards within an area. And so in that case, you actually, feel good to be a tourist. And there are plenty places around the world where that can be the case.
And is it, finally from you, Eoghan, is it almost impossible to ask people to make ethical choices when more and more perhaps people know less and less about the places that they are visiting?
I think the ethical choice is to travel. I think travel is always good. It's good for the locals. It's good for the people who travel. There'll be less world conflict if people travelled more. The question always comes down is to the dispersing, get rid of the bottlenecks. It's like a traffic problem. What Carol Gleeson is doing in Burren, the Burren has just been mentioned. The Burren Food Group, the Burren has got a whole culinary reputation it didn't have 10 years ago. And that wouldn't have happened without large numbers of people coming in and them having to look at it. What Caroline Boland has done in the Dingle Peninsula is similar, and what Etna Cosgrove and Biddy Hughes are doing in Westport. I think within Ireland we have to look at spreading, not just getting out of the bottlenecks, and we have some along the west coast, but spreading it through the year. Nobody would complain if we had more tourists in February, March, April. And another point I'd like to make of just bringing up Airbnb, not a force for bad at all. What Airbnb has done has helped make tourism affordable for people around the world. A whole new generation is growing up. But again, it's all about management. And also, let's not be complacent that all these things that I'm talking about are accepted by local populations. We've seen elections in America and referendums in Britain in the last year, which have shown the danger of having being complacent about the argument about globalisation, for instance.
Okay.
Ethical tourism is all about doing things responsibly, behaving responsibly when you go to places, and not putting the pressure points on that really upset the locals or damage the fragile hostile environments, and there is a middle way forward. But I would argue really, really strongly from the heart that travel is good, more travel is good, and we should be travelling more often and encouraging everyone around us to do the same, because that's a force for the good.
Final thought from you, Chris.
Well, my final thought is that no matter what we say here and now, that ultimately political decisions are made at local, national, international level that impact upon tourism and particular destinations. And I don't know, I say this in a pessimistic way, I don't know if politicians will always make a decision that the local people and the poorest of the poor in a particular area should gain from tourism, because they will always have certain sections of society that influence them more than others. And here in Northern Ireland, unfortunately, we don't even have politicians at the moment who can make those decisions.
A text on the Camino: I've just completed the 500-mile journey, and for me it was a truly spiritual journey. The pilgrims have revived the livelihoods of the villagers who live along the way. Pilgrims are welcomed and taken care of in a real spirit of humanity. And another one for now. Too many tourists spoil the holiday for the tourist. And Ted in Belfast says, I frequent city centre bars all year round. Come the tourist season, the prices go up and you are ignored. They quickly forget the dark days of November when few go in during the week. Final thoughts from you, Suzanne?
Yes, I would agree with Eoghan exactly that tourism is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful activity, and I would encourage everyone to go out and see the world. But we need to learn from those best practice examples. We need to look at those who are doing it right, that are looking for good growth, and we need to share these best practices and learn from those. Well,